comes to addressing climate change. The world scientists are saying it's now or never. Reducing the worst impacts of climate change will require unprecedented changes within society. We need to change how we power our economies, how we produce and consume goods, and we need to fix our broken relationship with nature. The corporate sector has a central role to play in rapidly reducing emissions. Companies are facing increased pressure to act. Pressure from shareholders, customers, investors, and civil society. And as concern for climate change continues to grow, so too will this pressure. Thankfully, there are signs of hope. We are seeing a massive uptake of companies setting targets in line with climate science. Companies are starting to decouple their emissions from economic growth. These are signs of a changing landscape that is moving in the right direction. We have the solutions available now in all sectors that can more than halve our emissions by 2030. Our goal is to help speed up the process and make sure our ambitions meet the challenges that lie in front of us. WWF is laying out an ambitious action plan for companies to follow that will help them achieve their targets and go beyond to take meaningful action and help restore our planet's natural systems. We call this Beyond Net Zero. It is an ambitious pathway that highlights what action companies are expected to take. We are going beyond a simple action list and including the metrics, practical guidance, and best practices. Going beyond net zero is done by halving emissions by 2030 and achieving net zero by 2050 at the latest, through financing and supporting additional climate and nature solutions within and beyond the value chain, engaging responsibly and actively in climate policy, engaging with other companies and organizations around shared solutions, and enabling and inspiring customers. Companies can use this guidance to strengthen their climate ambitions, set clear targets, and take credible actions. No company currently reaches the ambition we're setting now, but that's the point. This is what leadership looks like in a climate emergency. We have been working with several of our corporate partners to help develop this guidance. They are part of a small but growing group of companies that have clearly understood the science, the benefits of cutting emissions, and the risks of inaction. This is only the beginning of this project. Our intention is to build on the actions listed and provide additional guidance and case studies for all businesses. A corporate climate leader should strive to maximize its contribution to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. With this guidance, WWF is showing every business how to step up and become a climate leader. We urge your business to commit to net zero and go beyond.
Thank you. Is that working? No? Hello? Is that working? Yeah? Look. Not working? Or working? Fantastic. I'm just going to have to put my face right in it. So, apologies to anyone who uses this after me. I promise I haven't got COVID. No, there's no pandemic going on. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning for this Climate Business Network event on behalf of WW International, and in particular, thanks to our esteemed group of panelists here who are going to help us talk about the transition to net zero as well as nature positive. So let me just first of all quickly welcome some colleagues here. So on my right, we've got Doug Sabo, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer at Visa. If you can do the symbol for me later. What happens? What's Visa? He says every time he introduces himself, click, click, tap, tap. And then you know who Visa is. Not that anyone else would have any trouble with that. And then on my left, we have Henrik Sudberg from H&M, the Climate Impact Lead. And as well, from Reckitt Benckiser, David Croft, who is the Global Head of Sustainability. So 3 absolutely gigantic companies, and we're depending on you, along with many others, to help us make this transition to net zero. So let me just start with a broad question to start with. What are your targets, if I can ask all 3 of you, and how far away are you from meeting them? Doug, let me start with you.
Well, I'm going to start with a song since I have this microphone. But first, thank you to WWF. It's such a terrific organization that really leads the way in showing how to work and partner with the private sector. And it's been an inspiration to be involved in the WWF, the Climate Business Network. And it's been a terrific relationship. So at Visa, the payments company, We have a few overall goals that are guiding us. We have a goal for carbon neutral operations that we've achieved and we want to continue to achieve. We have a 100% renewable electricity commitment that we also have achieved, and we want to deepen the approach to that. We have our net zero emissions by 2040 goal. We have science-based targets by 2030. And then we have a final goal that sounds soft, but it's actually the most impactful one. And that's a goal to be a climate positive company, where we as a company, we're a small technology company ourselves. Our brand is huge, but we're only 25,000 people. Our operational footprint is modest. But the goal in climate positive is, how do we help the 2.5 billion consumers who use our network to purchase, to consume? How do we help connect them to their footprint to be able to take and give agency to make more sustainable choices in their consumption?
Can I just ask a follow-up question on that? I don't know the technicalities of this, but if you're a customer of Visa's, do those emissions made by those customers every time they use a Visa count towards your Scope 3 emissions? And if so, what do you do about that? What are you doing about that?
It's a great question. Our model is actually B2B2C, so our customers are actually banks. So 15,000 financial institutions around the world are our clients, and then consumers are their customers. We've had this question, we've asked ourselves, we've asked a number of external folks, consumer consumption, purchasing, using our network, is that our Scope 3? So far, and we've talked to a lot of NGOs, we've talked to engineering and environmental firms and other experts, they've said, if you did that, if your peer network based out of New York did that, you'd basically just be measuring the world's consumption. So while we have not included that in our Scope 3, we view that as our Scope 4, and that's actually where the bulk of our work is, the most impactful things, but it's not technically today seen as our Scope 3, but I'd love to keep that discussion going. The banks are in our Scope 3, and so there's a lot of work that we're doing to help provide them new solutions around what they can do to help their customers know the footprint of their spend. We have a partnership with a third party called Ecolytic, and it's about how they can turn on the capabilities in the core banking app to show customers, here's the estimated carbon footprint of each of your transactions. Here's personalized, customized education about the choices you could have made that are more sustainable. We're also working, and we'll come back to this, I'm going to hog all the time, working in areas like transit, EV charging, travel and tourism, a variety of others around the consumption side.
Very, very interesting. Thank you, Doug. And you can see why working through a company like Visa, you can have absolutely enormous impact on the consumption habits and financed emissions of millions of people and millions of organizations around the world. So can I turn to Hendrik? Tell us a little bit about your targets and what your plans are and how far you are away from meeting them.
Yeah, thank you very much. So H&M Group, a global fashion retailer, and we have science-based targets that are approved, both according to 1.5 degree pathway, but also net zero. So towards 2030, we're aiming at minus 56% in absolute terms. Even closer. So minus 56%, both in Scope 1 and 2, but primarily Scope 3, where 99% of our emissions are. So those are our science-based targets, and then we have a net zero target towards 2040. And to comment on how we are reaching them, or if we are reaching them, I would say where we are right now, we are in line where we should be, but of course we are only a few years into that period. So I think that we can project and see that we're going in the right direction, definitely.
And so, is it going to be a smooth trajectory towards those targets? You say you're just a few years into it. What happens when you get to the hard stuff, and what are the hard bits that you're going to find it difficult to tackle in that trajectory on your journey?
So it's not a smooth line. It's gonna go up and down like this, and I really expect it to. So 1 year will be a little bit above the line, and the next year will be a little bit below the line. I think there's a lot of things that will be challenging. And as we see it now, we have to move the ball in every area we can prioritize one area for a while, but then we have to move on and prioritize the next. So we have to work kind of on all fronts, because a lot of the things that we do, when we invest directly in our suppliers, for example, those changes take a lot of time before they show up in our Scope 3. So an investment made today can take years and years before it shows up in our Scope 3. So kind of being long-term in those investments, I think, is one of the things that we'll see the payoff. Yeah.
So can I turn to you on Reckitt Benckiser? Tell us the same question to you, really, your targets and plans to deliver them.
Yes, of course. And good afternoon, everybody. You might not know who Reckitt Benckiser is, so maybe I should just start that off. You might not know the company Reckitt Benckiser, but I guarantee you'll know the brands that we have around the world. These are brands like Dettol or Lysol that have been helping combat COVID over the last 2 years. They're brands like Nurofen on pain relief. They're brands like Durex. And in the hygiene side, it's brands like Finish and Vanish that have been helping people protect their health against the impacts of climate change. And our sense on climate change as an organization, as a company, is focused very much on the impacts on people's lives, their day-to-day lives, the health impacts, and helping through health literacy and brands and products, as well as our decarbonisation work, to prepare and support people, but also try and do our utmost to prevent going beyond 1.5 degrees. So we have targets that are based on that. We have science-based targets on both Scope 1 and 2 and 3. 65% absolute reduction by 2030 from Scope 1 and 2, and 50% product footprint by 2030. The good news on the Scope 1 and 2 is we got to 66% last year. So it's moving well. We've got interim targets that go beyond that, helping us to sort of look further towards a goal of being net zero by 2040 across the whole value chain. We're trying to define that in terms of how we take steps in terms of energy efficiency, for example, in terms of how we reduce the product carbon footprint, in terms of how we design products and actually move the whole of our product portfolio, which is huge. I mean, we put products into people's homes every day. We reach 20 million households every day. And so as we reduce our product footprint, we're also designing those products so that they use less energy in the home as well. So that helps our indirect Scope 3 footprint. And it also means that from a consumer point of view, it connects very much to the energy that they use in the home, the water they use in the home, and helping them to use less energy and water on a day-to-day basis, while still maintaining protection, self-care against the impacts of climate change on health. So it's very much woven into what the core business is about, and driving health and hygiene and nutrition benefits whilst decarbonising, based on that interim target, energy efficiency, intermediary target to 2030 for science-based targets, and that longer-term goal, 2040, for net zero.
David, can you tell me a little bit about the process of change within Reckitt Benckiser, the journey you've been on as an organisation? How difficult was it, or how easy was it, to persuade others internally to go on this journey that you've been on? What challenges did you face, and how did you overcome them?
Well, I think the journey is different, or the challenges of the journey is different for different organisations. But as soon as we started to make that connection between the brands, the core business of health, hygiene and nutrition, and actually the corporate purpose that we have to protect, heal and nurture in the relentless pursuit of a cleaner, healthier world, you start to really coalesce around why the business is there, what we do through our brands, how that enables better health, hygiene and nutrition, and how you can do that in a range of different ways, both for people who use the products day in, day out, but also how we run that whole value chain, how we decarbonise our operations, how we design products that are more innovative and more sustainable. And so we continue to delight people through the brands, but we do so also by making them more sustainable. And we developed a sustainable innovation calculator. Every time we design a new product, it goes through this calculator. It's a proxy carbon, water, chemical, and packaging footprint tool. And the goal is every new product is better than its predecessor. But then we also incentivize people. We've incentivized all of the leadership team so that we have to continue to improve our scope 1 and 2 reduction. If they don't get it better than where we are now, they don't get their bonus. We also incentivize them on driving more sustainable products. So innovating, designing them, but then promoting them so that when people use those products, they also use less water. And you know, this is one of the strange things. We can design a product that allows you to, in the case, I'll use clothes as an example because Henrik sat here, that gives clothes longer lives, Vanish. It gets stains out of clothes, gives clothes longer lives. And we all know, sorry to say this, Henrik, the footprint of the fashion sector. But if we can continue to make it more sustainable, then that benefits everybody. But when you put your clothes into the washing machine, you have to make a conscious choice to turn the dial down. And I'm of an age when washing machines, when I was growing up, only started at 40 degrees. Even now, my washing machine defaults to 60 degrees in some cycles. I have to actively turn it down. So the other piece that's really important is how we engage with those 20 million households every day and persuade them to make little changes like turning the dial down on the washing machine, because we've designed a product that still works just effectively at 20 degrees and 30 degrees to get stains out of clothes so clothes have longer lives.
Great. Thank you very much. I mean, I'd love to hear a little bit more about incentive structures inside the company. I noted you were just saying, David, yours are around scope 1 and 2. How do you, okay, come back in it later in a minute on that. How do you incentivize change in this area inside the company to drive the sorts of positive actions we need to see?
Well, it's a great question, and one I too also want to come back on the comments on how does this happen? How does the evolution happen inside the company? I think we all probably, especially if you have kids, you'll know the song "We Don't Talk About Bruno," which went around and around. It's probably in my head now, maybe in your head too. At Visa a couple years ago, when I was saying, "Hey, we really need to talk about consumption," oh, we don't talk about consumption. We don't talk about Bruno. We don't talk about consumption. But it's been such a sea change, and it was a sea change that came about from many streams coming together to form the river of wanting to focus on this. It was shifts in consumer behavior, higher demand from the consumers who actually want to do this. There was, from our bank customers, interest and set goals, scope 1, 2, and 3 goals. They wanted to come along. They've been knocking on our door of like, hey, what solutions do you have around this topic? There were certainly the investors and the investor interest, the government requirements, our employees asking us to talk about this, and then even the merchant partners, we call the merchant side, that's we call the merchants. They were saying, even you say pick one sector, travel and tourism, like the leading airlines, the leading hotel brands, and many of them we have co-brand relationships. You might have an airline card, a hotel card. They want to come on this journey too, and so all these streams were coming together and say it's time to talk, not only talk about, but take action in these areas. And when we take action, then it is, how do you align it with incentives? So we actually, first we set for our corporate executive team from our compensation committee of the board, we tied executive compensation to a set of ESG goals, including our climate goals. And then we actually also went beyond that the following year and put it into how the bonus pool is funded for the entire company. So all the 26,000 employees of Visa have a connection to our climate goals, some of our S goals, our G goals as well.
Henrik, I don't know if you want to add on that a little bit on H&M's journey and the incentive structure internally to drive this change.
Thanks. Yeah, we also have on kind of the management level, we have incentives there, but I think the incentives that we direct to our suppliers, so not internally, but how we drive the kind of orders we place and which suppliers we work with, that has been incentivized for 10 years at H&M, depending on their sustainability performance, including climate then. And then, of course, that is continuously kind of updated and improved. So I think that is one of the more important incentive structures that we have from that sense. But I can also mention that we have put out a sustainability-linked bond. So sustainability-linked bond. This basically means that we put finance out there and connect that to the performance we have on our climate targets and other sustainability metrics. So that really incentivizes us as well to go for these targets because we have a direct financial connection to reaching them. And then we use the money put into that bond. We use that money to finance the transition on the suppliers. So it's kind of a good ecosystem for us there with the financial incentive as well.
That's really, really interesting. One of the things I've heard a lot about this week is the way that forcing increasing disclosure along the supply chain in Scope 3 is forcing even more collaboration between competitors and between suppliers and within a supply chain and within geographies and between geographies. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, about the in the fashion industry. You must be using some of the same suppliers, some of the same water courses. How do you work with competitors, if at all, to improve Scope 3 along your supply chain with them?
That's a really relevant question. I think we as you mentioned, we are not alone. We're basically never alone at a supplier site. I think on average we're about 10-15%, something like that, of the supplier's full capacity. So when we transition a single supplier, when we take away a coal boiler and replace it with an electric boiler, then that's a big reduction that we put in on the supplier, basically making it a zero-emission supplier. But a lot of the rest of the industry goes in and does this as well. So I mean, we know we can't wait. So we have already started doing these investments and rolling them out. But I think it's really important that we get accounting frameworks and kind of incentive frameworks in place, so that when we can get together with our partners on those suppliers and help out in this transition. So that's a really important piece of this puzzle, I think, to get that clarity.
Great, and very challenging. I would imagine. I'm interested in the competition law aspect of this and how you have that sort of collaboration there. Anyway, if I can turn to you, David, on interested in your thoughts on because there's been tons of voluntary disclosure frameworks and pushes to get companies to publish their transition plans. What do you think the role is of regulation in this situation? Where do you think the best examples are coming from in terms of regulation to support the transition?
I think the push on transparency through regulation is obvious. Where regulation can help is to provide consistency of frameworks, because the challenge of some of the voluntary approaches is there are variations and nobody quite agrees on exactly which 100% of stuff should be reported or the scope of that reporting. Once you get it into a more policy base, then there's a consistency, and that helps, because once you have consistency, then the ability to join up, as Henrik was saying, throughout that value chain becomes simpler. And this goes back. We've seen this happen progressively in other aspects of ESG. Originally, if you go back 20, 30 years, it was about food safety and quality standards. Then it became human rights issues. And then now it's much more about how do you want to be consistent in the reporting and the transparency. Now, I think that also becomes really important for the investor community, because whenever I speak with them, they are super keen to be able to compare fairly how different people are doing. And that's where that consistent framework helps again. Now, I think it can still go further. We see TCFD coming through, and the definitions around disclosure, the guidance around disclosure continues to tighten, get better, but there are still different qualitative approaches to it. And I think progressively we'll see that tighten, not just, however, driven by the policy framework, but driven by the market dynamic of investors asking more pointed questions and expecting that disclosure. And I think for me it's interesting, and I've seen this a little bit last year at COP and this year at COP. I think sometimes the private sector and the market dynamic is moving faster than the policy dynamic is, because investors are demanding it. And that's not just for climate, it's also for nature and TNFD, nature-related financial risks. Our largest investor, and I will be meeting to discuss nature-related financial risk in the next 2 or 3 months. We haven't yet seen the next phase of TNFD's testing stuff. We haven't got to the final stage of the guidance, but the expectation amongst the investor community is already that you start to shape that. So policy framework, critical for giving consistency, but the market dynamic, I think, is moving faster.
And I think that's something I've definitely seen these few weeks these few days. I keep saying this in COP. Every day is 1 week here. But just a quick plug for the UK's transition plans task force, which WWF UK has been very involved in, and the guidance for firms, draft guidance is out, and so we're looking for firms to try it out and tell us what they think, or tell the government what they think of the framework. I'm going to open it up, if I can, to comments or questions from the audience to drive a bit of a discussion here. Does anyone have any? Thomas.
I'll kick us off. There's lots of... I'm Thomas Ball, WWF, so sorry, I'll get it started, hopefully get some others going. We've seen in lots of different companies, small businesses coming up with innovations which we know can be really impactful, but they just haven't been scaled yet. So, very simple examples for maybe that would be relevant for RB would be, refillable bottles or something like that, which we know some supermarkets and retailers are rolling out. For H&M, maybe it's companies where you can rent clothing and it's taken back if it's actually at the end of use and it's recycled and sent back. Or Patagonia that repairs clothes for free. Visa, I don't have a very good example for, but I'm sure there's a very good example one. But I guess the question is why? What's stopping it from being scaled? Is it a tension against business models? Is it a tension against some of the suppliers you work with? So maybe the retailers are saying, yes, we think it's a great idea, but we can't do it yet. We can't roll it out in every store. Is it consumers who aren't ready for that yet because it's a very small niche who want to have those sorts of services because refillable bottles aren't for everybody, or renting your clothing isn't for everybody? What is it that's holding back that innovation? Because we've only got 8 years. We need that to roll out. And I've only given really simple examples. I'm sure there's lots of others, but I'm curious what you all think.
First of all, I want to know why Reckitt gets its own microphone and we have to share. Did you bring it yourself? You're like, here, I'm going to be on a panel. Let me bring my microphone out. Great question. In our case, it actually is the third-party firm that I mentioned around the consumer solutions to see their footprint. It's a third party called Ecolytic. We helped incubate them out of an incubator in Germany. It's public information, we've taken an investment stake in them, but you're exactly right, it's some of these small startup companies that have these really cool, innovative ideas, and then they partner with us because we can take them to scale. And so they could go knock on the doors, because their solution is for financial institutions to turn on for consumers. They could go to 15,000 firms individually, one by one, or we can just put out the broad notice that, hey, we have this now available all in one fell swoop. So we are moving as quickly as possible to scale, but there is a question about do consumers actually want this capability? So we're backing up that we have this solution with the consumer research of, do consumers think about sustainability in their payments accounts when they look at their credit account, the debit account? Do they actually want to see the footprint? Do they care at that point? And actually, it's been surprising. The research that we've done is very high levels of interest in seeing that information. Maybe 65% of consumers in the US and Canadian research we did want that capability. It jumps to 80% of millennial and Gen Z consumers. And so that's part of our sale message too, is yes, maybe it's not for your entire portfolio, but especially if it's first-time card holders, younger adults, younger families, then this is a must-do, not a nice-to-have.
Can I just add to that question for Hendrik, which is some of these innovations will challenge your business. Just in the renting clothes, how are you going to continue to make money? Is there a future for fast fashion in 10 years' time? That's a big question. When you've got some of these innovations like renting clothes, etc., in the future.
I think we are already in that space. We have a renting program, we have a repair program, we sell kind of repair products, and we also invested and scaled a Swedish company called Sellpy, which basically consumer-to-consumer selling of second-hand or used, pre-loved clothes. And we've also integrated second-hand now on our webpage. I think we rolled out in Sweden and Germany for now, but then you can, where you browse for new things, you can also find these second-hand things. So I see this as a hugely important role for us to take to scale and be part of that. Not least for, as you say, that this is where we see everything is heading. Yeah.
So there's no threat to the industry from some of these innovations that are going to drive sustainability, but may threaten the core business of being a fast fashion firm.
I think the industry definitely needs to change, and I mean, for us, we want to be a part of that change, and we want to drive this. So we want to drive this and really be part of that change. Yeah, but it's needed.
David, tell me about RB and this model for innovation. Going back to Thomas's question, which is what's stopping the scalability of some of these innovations?
I think there are different factors that stop different types of activity depending on where you are in the value chain. And so, let me give you some examples, Thomas. We launched 2 years ago. We launched in the US a refill, a cartridge refill for Lysol. It saved 75% of all the plastic you would use. You didn't have to buy another trigger spray. You got this refill, plugged it together, off you go. People found it inconvenient to unplug and replug a cartridge. Some consumers loved it, but not enough consumers wanted it consistently, and more people would pull the full new trigger spray bottle off the shelf. Now, part of that was convenience. Part of that was the instantaneous, I want to solve a problem like COVID. Part of it was sometimes, if you're not careful, you break the elastic with consumers. And not every consumer, or actually in some cases like that, only a small minority of consumers are ready for that change. Now, it's our job to nudge. It's the retailer's job to nudge and to start to help make that change more the norm. We've seen that in other sectors. We've seen it, for example, in laundry detergents. We've seen progressively laundry detergents allow you to wash at lower temperatures. They've also become more and more concentrated. If you went back 20 years, they weren't concentrated. If you're concentrating laundry detergent, you're shipping less water, you're using less plastic, it's got a better footprint all around. But it takes time to move people, and we have to work collectively to build awareness and to make those shifts happen. If I think in another part of the value chain, with suppliers, and we've touched on suppliers already, sometimes suppliers, depending on where they are in the world, haven't started to think about the question and the challenge. They haven't yet got the technology. That's why we're investing in systems like Manufacture 2030, which doesn't just record with those smaller manufacturers. I'm not talking about big multinational manufacturers. I'm talking about SMEs who are often part of our supply chain. They'll be part of Henrik's supply chain, I'm certain, who haven't got the capacity internally to rapidly try and adapt their systems and processes. And this is where we can share stuff. We can share our learnings that we've been on this journey for the last 4 or 5 longer years, 10 years, and we can share some of the systems like Manufacture 2030, which doesn't just record people's environmental footprint, their carbon, their electricity, their water, their waste. It also gives them guidance on what to do to make it better. The more we help that to happen, the faster we spread that engagement and that improvement up the value chain. Because if we just expect everybody to have the same capacity and capability that has taken us many years to build, then we're being optimistic that they will move at the same pace, because they don't have that. So those are the sorts of things that we can do. But if I can just say one other thing. Too often for me, the conversation about how you make these change happens feels very long distance to many, many people. They're not internalizing, particularly in the global north, because we don't really see the day-to-day impacts of climate change. Okay, in the UK this year we had some temperatures above 40 degrees for the first time ever. But when the members of the public in the UK talk about the weather, we normally want things to be worse, and actually 3 days later you've forgotten the fact that it was 40 degrees because it's gone back to raining for 3 weeks. Not enough people in the global north have internalized that climate change is happening really quickly. It still feels long-term to them. And that's why for us the health impacts of climate change are critically important, because that does internalize it. And I think we have to think more about the science of change as well as the science of climate change to make this move faster.
Thank you. Sean, let's go here. This lady in the front.
Thank you. Thank you. It's working? Okay, so following up on your comments, and given that we're here at the Climate Education Hub, can you talk about the need and the role of formal climate education in building the green consumers, the employees that can innovate, and the supply chains? I think your point started to touch on that, but what kind of actions can you as businesses take in partnership with either government or directly to help promote and advance climate education, which sounds from your conversation as a critical piece to this problem? Thank you.
Doug, this seems off for you, doesn't it?
Oh, now I got another microphone. I love it. No, I think it's an important story. I think for Visa, one thing that we've started with, where do you start as a company? Start inside your four walls. And so we've started with our employees, and we've built out not only our annual Earth Month event, but we've started to do all around the calendar a whole sustainable living series of speakers and eco challenges and ways, and both of how employees in their personal lives can live more sustainably. And we also do an annual sustainable living study so we know where our employees are on this journey. So before we start talking to consumers about it, let's understand where our workforce. And we do that partly for actually to impact our workforce, but it's only 25,000 people. That's not a lot of scale. But because then it embeds and helps them connect to the broader work that we're doing as a company, and they start to bring that into their everyday thinking. Like, oh, I'm innovating on this new mobile payment. How can I bring sustainability and climate action into it? I'm working on a new rewards program, that a platform that banks can turn on to nudge behavior through greater incentives for taking sustainable behavior. So that's part of for us, it's been starting with the employees to work our way out. And then over time, we haven't done as much on the education of consumers. An annual study of consumers globally that Reckitt and WWF and Visa and IKEA and a couple other brands have done around a healthy and sustainable living study, so that before we start to talk to consumers, let's understand consumers, their barriers, their drivers for sustainable action. The 2022 results just came out last week, so I encourage you all to go to GlobeScan's website, globescan.com, and you can see the results of that. But that's the start where we are.
Thank you very much, because Visa obviously has, because of its brand, has an even bigger responsibility, I think, to do all of that consumer nudging and behavior, even though they're not part of your Scope 3. Sounds like a great example. Would either of you like to come in on that? David?
This is a truly properly roving mic now, isn't it? No, I think there's a whole range of things that both the public sector and the private sector can engage on to build climate literacy and awareness. And I'm reminded of years ago I was doing work about fair trade. Fair trade in the UK took off when it became part of the national curriculum. And all of a sudden, you had kids saying to their parents, why are we not buying fair trade chocolate? Why are you buying that? And that started to make a massive difference in the awareness and also the growth of more sustainable consumerism. The same is true on climate change. As Doug was just saying, the GlobeScan report's a great example of what people understand about climate change. We've just done, we just published another report yesterday about people's awareness of the impacts of climate change on health and what they can then do about it. And the short answer is, particularly if you're in the global north, most people don't see that that impact happening yet. Hence my point about we haven't internalized the challenge. But secondly, they don't know what to do about it. And sometimes the things they think they can do about it aren't in their gift, like buying a heat pump to replace your gas boiler. And so there's a huge role for brands like Reckitt's to nudge people and to help design products that allow you to do it. We have a program with Finish. It's a dishwasher brand. Not everybody in the world has a dishwasher. But for those of us who have, do you skip the rinse when you're using a dishwasher? Because if you don't, you're wasting 40 to 50 litres of water and all the energy to process and heat and treat that water. And that's why that program is something that we communicate very strongly with partnership with WWF and people like National Geographic in key water-stressed markets to get that message home. Because there's no point in us designing a product that will achieve that if we then don't persuade people to use it in that way. And it progressively builds that awareness of the impacts of climate change and what we can do in small ways to make a difference. Because if we start to do all those small things, then the ability or the propensity to buy the heat pump, or if you can afford it, buy a Tesla, might actually come. But without it, I don't think they will come, very quickly at least.
Yeah, thanks. So I can add another perspective from the education and training part. We are together with WWF rolling out the training on science-based target setting for our suppliers. So that is kind of also a capacity building and training for them to understand like the whole science and how they as a company can contribute. But of course, important for us as well to be on the same kind of journey and talk the same language. So that I think is one really interesting dimension, and it's a really good training with WWF as well. And I can also add what we've called like circular jobs. So basically, when we have when we're transitioning to a more circular economy, that will change the knowledge needed by the people in our supply chain. So we also have to consider what that will mean. Will it be what types of competence and the development do they need? So that's also something on this kind of education perspective that we take in.
Thank you. Really interesting. I'm just going to go to someone else, and then maybe you can come in a bit.
Hello. Hi. Can you hear me? Is this okay? No? All right. I'm just going to talk loudly. Thank you for the sharing so far. I'm from Singapore, also WWF, and I work very closely with the region companies based in there and their very intricate supply chains to decarbonize. And so I suppose my question really is, I appreciate the viewpoint on the consumer end as to how they can adopt the practices, but more on scaling innovation much more upstream. So when we're talking about sectors or certain markets that are still quite nascent in the way that they are targeting development, and they're doing their practices in terms of manufacturing perhaps, and even in the fashion sector, I'm quite keen to hear your viewpoint on what are the barriers of scaling innovation in that space, and what are some of the key things you hope to see so that those markets which are still quite, they have a long way to go, can sort of accelerate those actions that are needed for maybe your own SBTi targets, for example. Thank you.
Yeah. We work with innovations both on the kind of downstream side, so to take care of clothes when they have been used so many times that they can't be used anymore. So we to produce new materials and new input to our processes as well. So that I think is one really interesting area where there's a lot happening. And right now, maybe the biggest barriers to scaling is kind of having common and fairly easily available legislation, so that we can actually take and use this kind of waste product and produce new things from them. But of course, there's also some technological kind of scaling things that need to happen there. And if we look more on the supplier side, I think there's so many interesting new processes out there as well. So that we're looking to scale, and we do invest ourselves kind of in that as well. So both on kind of what chemicals we use, but also what process types, like dry dyeing, so we basically don't use any water at all in that. And I think that these things also take time. There's we have to build the facilities and build the competence to use it as well. So I think legislation and time, if we can say that that's a barrier, but we are in a hurry, so it is a challenge at least.
Can you give me some examples quickly, Hendrik, of the legislation that's been supportive? Have you seen any places where there's been legislation to drive innovation on the supplier side?
I think, for us, if we focus on what's coming now in the EU, there's a lot of legislation coming out there. I think there's a lot of good things in there for us to help taking care of the waste and making this into new fibers that we can use. But there is, it's still not there. There still needs to be kind of a common framework across the countries, because now it's very country specific. We have this manufacturer's responsibility or producer's responsibility that differs between countries. It makes it really difficult to kind of cross borders. So that is one challenge that I think that the EU textile strategy is addressing fairly well, but there's more needed there.
Let me try and give you two examples. I think, if I think about manufacturing upstream, as I was saying earlier, sometimes there's a lack of awareness about what the opportunities are. So things like Manufacture 2030 are a way of providing a system and also building awareness, sharing some of the knowledge that we've gained and others have gained upstream. But one of the other challenges oftentimes is access to capital, and how we can facilitate access to cheaper capital is actually something that we can drive, because what we know is that when our supply network talks to banks, they are a lower risk when the banks know that they're supplying into us, because they know that there's a continuity that we want that adds value. And I've seen that in all parts of the world. So we can start to promote that element that de-risks capital for people. Sometimes, and I think this is where an enabling policy environment can help, it's also useful to get enabling policy that supports faster moves to greener technology. Can we incentivize that? Often it's easy to have not just the carrot approach, but a stick. But sometimes the political choice about slowly raising the bar in the terms of the carrot and stick, and that's the stick, is harder to take. I think you've got to do both in that policy environment, and all too often I see less support to encourage, particularly not so much companies like Reckitt, but the smaller, the middle-sized companies to move faster to adopt. And I think that's where an enabling policy environment can help. If I go one step further back up that value chain, and we're talking about agriculture and farming, there the challenge is we often trying to solve issues in silos. We'll talk about climate change and agriculture, and then separately we'll talk about biodiversity, and separately we'll talk about social impact. We have to better join those things up into frameworks that, yes, enhance biodiversity, protect and enhance and strengthen biodiversity, but at the same time give you climate change solutions, nature-based insetting solutions, but also which respect and value and improve social equity and maybe even socioeconomic drives, because we're not connecting those three things terribly well. And as we start to see more of the TNFD framework coming through, I think we will see those three things joined together better, and that makes it easier for farmers to work on it. Because if you're trying to solve things in silos, it starts to feel like I've got a cost there for an intervention, I've got a cost there for an intervention, and I've got another cost there for an intervention, and it doesn't stack up. If we can roll things together and show that you can get greater value for investing across all three, then that makes life a lot easier for everybody, I think.
Sean, yeah.
Hi, guys. My name is Sean, and I'm a private citizen. How does partnerships with groups like WWF help unlock the changes you need, and what are they not doing that they should be doing?
I think that question was for me then. So I think that we, or you, and other NGOs play a really vital role in helping us navigate where should we aim, what should we do, and keep pushing us for these improvements. And also, if I may say, when we take a step forward and we are transparent, we put our supplier list up there, one of the first companies in our industry to do that, then a lot of the NGOs can help and start looking at the others, start asking the questions, but what are your suppliers, where are your supplier list, and help us kind of build that, raise that bar from the bottom up on what's a hygiene factor, because that's what putting your supplier list out there is now. You know, you can't really get away with not doing that. So I think that that's a really vital role that you guys and other NGOs play.
And I know I was pushing you on fast fashion, but I have to say H&M is obviously one of the leaders in this area, so very glad to hear that. I just wanted to ask one final wrap-up question, and maybe you can all reflect on this in your final concluding comments, which is, you know, we're talking of the biggest impacts here of climate change and nature loss are going to happen in some of the most vulnerable communities around the world. How do we make this transition happen in a way through the supply chain that supports those communities in the process? So that's my question. But if you can answer that and try and wrap up a little bit as well, that would be great.
I think for Visa the best example is looking at the travel and tourism space. So as we work on how do we make travel and tourism more sustainable, we need to look at how do you both reduce the negative environmental impacts and actually try to get to regenerative travel to make travel and tourism benefit the environment, but then how do you also look at the local community? And 1 in 10 jobs in the world is associated with travel and tourism. And so how do you drive local economic impact while taking those actions to help support that industry and help it to continue to grow and thrive, but in a way that is good for people, good for planet, good for economies, good for communities. And that's probably the way we're actually part of a coalition of travel companies. So it's Visa together with Trip.com, TripAdvisor, Booking, Expedia, Google, and others. It's called The Travelist, co-founded by Prince Harry, now the Duke of Sussex. So we get to do monthly calls with Prince Harry, which is always fun. But that's part of the whole mission, is how do we come together to drive sustainable travel and tourism that can actually help with the local communities. And so, because especially the Global South, heavy reliance on travel and tourism in many markets, many countries. It's also, by the way, coming back a little bit on the education, and I'll wrap up topic, it's one where consumers, it's not about education necessarily for consumers, but how do you remove confusion for consumers around what sustainable travel is? The whole point of this, one of the points of that Travelist Coalition, is to address the challenge of all the different eco-labels and certifications and scoring systems that consumers face when they're trying to book sustainable travel, and you're getting different answers from site to site to site. And so now it's these highly competitive companies in the marketplace coming together and say, all right, let's come up with a common framework for how to do this so that consumers have better access to that information in a consistent way across all those different platforms, and do so in a way that doesn't also trip up some of the anti-competitive regulations that you alluded to earlier. But I think that's where I'd go.
And one of the best things about this whole Scope 3 reporting and disclosure and planning area is that some of those impacts of companies in the global north can be so much better seen, so you can tackle some of the inequalities and the drivers of, say, deforestation that happen. It becomes less of a north-south divide and more along the supply chain. You can see that chain of responsibility. Anyway, Hendrik, do you want to conclude? And then, David, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, so I think that we look a lot on this kind of adaptation and resilience in the communities where we have our production. So you can say like within our value chain type of adaptation and resilience, but and I think that's fairly clear, like with TCFD and other frameworks, that this is kind of risk management to some perspective, but of course also like taking responsibility for the societies we are in. But I think there needs to be more work done on the kind of beyond our own value chain section of this resilience and adaptation as well. And I know there's a lot of discussions here on that topic, so that's great. And I think we on the kind of on the private side need to dig in and see what comes out here on that side. And I can just add on a completely different note. I also think it's important that we keep the 1.5 alive. I think I hear a lot here now in the halls around that, and we need to make that a priority to keep 1.5 in the documents of the coming out of here. So kind of a side point, but thought I'd throw it in there.
It's absolutely an essential point. I couldn't agree more, Henrik. I think, to think about the most vulnerable communities, I think there's always going to be a role that we have to play to support people who are not in our value chain, and to enable them, in our case, access to health literacy, access to health and hygiene, and help them protect themselves. But at the same time, we can use our value chain to make that work better. And I think when I think about some of the small farmers I work with, southern Thailand, they're farming rubber, they may have 10 hectares. It starts from how do we create extra value in this conversation from that value chain for them? How do we start to have a conversation about the ecosystem service that, if they farm in a certain way, protects the ecosystem, adds extra value back in terms of carbon, but also continues to give us the product that we need to provide, in this case, rubber, sexual health and well-being in the biggest brand of condoms around the world. And I think as we start to build that ecosystems services model, because it is driven by frameworks like TCFD or TNFD, because we can use nature-based insetting approaches, we will start to drive more value for farmers in that situation that changes the value dynamic that they currently have. It stops it being a simple traded commodity. It becomes something that has added value beyond it. And I think that theme cuts across a whole range of things. We shouldn't be buying carbon as a commodity. We should be looking for added value carbon. Just in the same way that we're not trying to buy latex as a commodity, we're trying to buy it with added value, because we know in the long term that's a more resilient, from a carbon, biodiversity and social perspective, supply chain that adds value throughout. And it goes back to what I was saying before, and this is my closing point. We have to join up those different agendas, because that's where the added value comes from, and that's actually where the pace of change will go faster, and we need that pace of change to happen faster all the way around.
Listen, David, if I could have you in my meetings with ministers that I have on the interconnection between climate, nature and people, I'll just have you on tape next to me if I can't have you in the room. Listen, thank you so much, Doug, Henrik, David. Really, really grateful, and really grateful to the audience for being here in a series of talks that's highly competitive. I hope we can try and compete with the clapping that went on behind us, and say thank you very much, and see you all soon.